I want to do a few things, but allow me first to ask you to celebrate yourselves because you represent our future, but you also represent something very important. You represent the struggle of people who refuse to die. And I then want you to just turn to your neighbor and remind them that when you started doing this, you were doing philanthropy, and the last couple of months and weeks have assured you that you are now in the business of liberation. So you, my friends, are liberation fighters or freedom fighters. There are unprecedented events in the world, uncertainty in the global economy that, Minister, please do convey our gratitude to His Excellency and the leadership here for hosting a conversation on philanthropy's future. I have entitled my own presentation, Reimagining, Emancipatory and Reparative Philanthropy in Uncertain Times. In Rwanda, they have a practice called Jirinya, or one cow per family. They have Ubudehe, which is about local development. And they set up a fund here called Agashiro, which was the Dignity Fund. I want to anchor presentations on Jirinya's conception of wealth as shared. And you will understand why the essence of my presentation is to escape the historical trajectory of philanthropy as anchored in three Victorian age thoughts. Number one, which is the idea that those who are well-to-do or a religious or social duty to share their wellness with those that are not well-to-do. And the second, which developed as the United Kingdom and the so-called developed world began to modernize, which was the idea that you could, through social engineering, change the plight of people who had been eviscerated by capitalism. This was the idea that what you would do is teach a man or a woman to fish instead of giving them a fish. And many of you have heard me say, well, that depends on whether there are still rivers or the rivers have been dried up by climate change and overconsumption. So it won't matter whether you are teaching me how to fish or giving me a fish. There is no way to do either. And this is where we are, and welcome. It means what we're discussing today is reimagining philanthropy itself and its Western basis, and looking at African homegrown solutions and whether these present us with an alternative. Number one, so these unprecedented global shifts are in trade. They are in transforming demographics, in artificial intelligence, in aid cuts, in rising military investments, in the loss of faith in multilateralism. If you take women and rural populations and other marginalized groups, they are disproportionately affected by global volatility, economic shifts, and emerging technologies. Political instability, economic uncertainty, climate crisis, and social fragmentation are linked and worsening in some instances. But integrated and adaptive strategies that are required to transform adversity into opportunity are emerging from the global majority world or global south, who are beginning to forge their own visions from regional cooperation to mini-lateralism. Now, I need to say this because if you look at transforming demographics, we're told by the United Nations that the global population will reach 9.7 billion by 2050, that Africa's population will double. However, we're also told there is a fertility crisis in East Asia, in the countries we looked up to for development, which is South Korea and Japan. Some are entering negative growth rate. But there is also a similar crisis in Europe. And the estimates are that in Europe and in East Asia, the people above the age of 65 will double. And this will impact the skills gap and rising cost of upskilling people who had worked in a particular mode who now have to use AI and etc. But it will also mean something else, because conversely, Africa's population is more youthful, becoming more technologically savvy. And this has raised, some of you describe it in political terms, the rise of the right, populism, anti-diversity, equity, and exclusion, or inclusion. Let me narrate it for you, Irungu, my brother, and simply say that the racialized security framing of these demographics is what has led to the conception of black and brown babies as a threat versus a dividend. So let's strip it for what it is and not pretend that people are just making a mistake in their framing. It is deliberate. So if you listen to the far right, they say things that others who are more liberal are afraid to say. That what will happen to us because there is an invasion of the civilization quadrant. India just overtook Japan last month in terms of size. And this is going to continue, my friends. And what is the mental disposition that Africans who are watching these global developments supposed to adopt? And it seems to me that when you look at aging populations in Europe and in the areas I've described, they will require care work. Can somebody say care work with me? Care work. So the new global focus on care economy is not necessarily because we care that much about African domestic workers being exploited in the Middle East or being exploited in Europe or elsewhere, or African health workers that are going in droves. No, it is because the empire now has need for native salvation. And the native is not conscious of power and is unable to negotiate bilateral arrangements by which our skilled care workers can get remunerated adequately, reasonably, and decently, because we still think like recipients of aid. The tragedy, my friends. We're told generative AI will contribute 4.4 million to the global economy, that the African continent has the potential and the opportunity to leapfrog with technology. And yet 52% of Africa's rural population still lacks access to technology. And there is a serious gender divide amongst rural women and girls who are most excluded. So we are talking about the potential. And the real potential, which is Africa's human capital, it remains underserviced, underreached, underinvested in. And I'm not talking to government, Minister. You've already said what the imperatives of government are. I'm talking to you who give money, you who receive money, you who engage for purposes of development. Your forays into the rural area have not been to build Africa's potential to become the next growth pole, but you have been fixated, and rightly so, because this is your historically assigned colonial division of labor role. You've been fixated with fixing poverty and misery. You've been fixated with fixing the fact that, people are arrested, they are violated, and that's very important. But protest predisposition, tragedy predisposition, without foresight and imagination, will essentially mean in the next 100 years, we'll still be fixing the problems of underdevelopment, of exclusion, and of immiseration. So I didn't come here to talk to people and say to you, because US aid has exited, philanthropy must give more to the sector. Well, giving more to what? What sector? Doing what? Imagining what? What are those imaginations of liberation that makes our sector worthy of the policy changes that you're talking about, Minister? Worthy of the sort of transformative historical role, to use Frantz Fanon's term. Each generation must discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it in relative opacity. What is this generation of philanthropist's mission? If your generation is to get more money alternative to US aid to do exactly what you have been doing, then you are betraying the potential of Africa to become that giant, to become a global Africa. My friends, the nature of prosperity in the world has moved towards nature-based prosperity. More and more people are talking about critical minerals. Why are critical minerals critical? To enable energy transition. Why is energy transition critical? To enable us to rely less on the decimation of our environments or the earth, so that we don't kill ourselves with our prosperity based on overconsumption. But here is the reality. The owners of critical minerals, the communities within which these critical minerals sit, watch critical minerals being developed and they themselves are overpassed, overreached, bypassed, overlooked by the development of critical minerals. Why? Because their governments have not thought through holistic strategies. Their philanthropies are only happy for them to get free, prior, and informed consent to stay in servitude. Never to become core, key owners, beneficiators, and therefore industrialize on their own terms, but purely to accept that the money from elsewhere is what they need. It's okay when you are hungry, a bowl of soup may be good. But for you to trade your birthright, for a bowl of soup does not say much about your intellectual acumen. So my friends, I came to say to you, since you are the NGO elite, myself included, that our disconnect from futures mentality, systemic analysis, our disconnect from understanding that our local misery, oppression, suppression, and exclusion must be appreciated within their coloniality of global power context and their imperial context, essentially means we continue to do these binaries of assessments where national problems are reducible to one bad leader, and the imagination of liberation is never imagined in black or brown terms, even when statistics suggest otherwise. So I came to say to you, if you wake up today, at least today in Serena, it might help our continent within the next 10 years. So if we are to redefine prosperity for those who are feminists, prosperity for those of you who are pro-justice, pan-Africanists, what does that prosperity based on the nature economies that achieves balance look like? Now, you must understand me, this doesn't mean you don't need any support from elsewhere. It essentially means you can get a lot of support from elsewhere, and the support will go to servicing your misery. How does philanthropy become an investment? If you look at global development trends, we are now dominated by oligopolies and monopolies, international finance capital, and green imperial interests. So Africans like cliches. Somebody comes with an anecdote, green. Yes, it's important to have green development, but the cost of running anything on lithium batteries or producing lithium batteries requires a lot more water, more than 10 times more water than the water we're using for the dirty energies. So what we need civil society to be figuring out is what is that gap between green and where we are, and how do we bring people who are excluded from where we are, the dirty energy, into the green. It's not simply teaching them to conserve water or teaching them to, because it is not the people who are hyper consumers. It is the people who are doing the mining, the excavation. What is the compensatory investment that must be made by those who are investing in green technology and green energy? My friends, you are scandalous echo chambers of the empire because you do not invest sufficiently in knowledge, in questioning good is good, but what is the cost of good? So I'm not saying don't do green. I'm simply saying count the cost, so that when you are giving away wetlands in your country, when you are giving away large pieces of land for green energy, for carbon financing, you fully understand what the cost to your people's futures, not to current things are. Why am I saying these things? I've been asked to come and talk about philanthropy and tell you that USAID has cut, it will come to 60 billion. The Dutch government is promising to cut 2.4 billion, and this will affect women and black organizations who get 0.1% to 0.35% of all foundation globally. That over 81% of black feminist organizations don't actually have enough to survive and to do their work, that African disability organizations and global disability. My friends, this is very important. But what's more important is they will stay in this position until this sector begins to do a reimagination of the economy, distribution in the economy, equity in the economy, and imagination of future economies where our people are not just participants, they are owners and they hold equity, and equity for themselves and for future generations. That's a fundamental point. So it's not to me as interesting that we're in a crisis. It's not to me as interesting that we haven't reached full deglobalization, that we're seeing the rise of populist nationalist movements, that there is a backlash against certain rights, that civic space is being shrunk, that there are tensions between philanthropy, where you have corporate DEI cutbacks in the US, social fragmentation, disinformation, and etc. These are important. You are educated so that you sound like those who educated you. Keep repeating these things, right? There's a rise of dictatorship. There's a rise of authoritarianism. You sound relevant. What else would you say if you had Harvard, Princeton, or you have to say these things because a parrot must sound like its master. But I didn't come to Africa, to Kigali, to hear you repeat cliches. I came here to ask, what is the link between Africa's natural resource wealth, Africa's philanthropy, Africa's middle class, and finding alternatives? What is the link between African taxation systems and women who provide care work, who bail out the state, get no recognition, and are treated as the poverty index measurements for every country? When does the fiscus begin to measure what the women do as a contribution to the economy? Because we know that nutrition security is related to cognitive capabilities. When do we get to doing certain things our own way? My friends, the issue is not whether or not you should get foreign direct investment. The issue is not whether or not you should get external resources. The issue is when you get external resources and you have no transformative strategy of turning your people from paupers to wealth holders, wealth owners, wealth creators, then what you are simply doing is worse than the traditional chiefs were forced to do. The colonial enterprise came and said, "Chief, we'll give you sugar." And they came to some who say, "We'll give you chewing gum. Just keep chewing, don't swallow it. When it finishes, we'll stop digging." They're still digging today because the chewing gum didn't finish. The chiefs died. I need you to understand that colonialism is not the presence of white people in your country. Colonialism is not the presence of foreigners in your country. The coloniality of power is a mentality that you accept your assigned place as a dependent in the global division of labor and a provider of raw materials, incapable of designing technology, incapable of creating power and wealth, incapable of becoming a competitor, incapable of ending your own poverty without that external help, incapable of creating knowledge that's alternative, knowledge that's independent, incapable of taking knowledge that you've been given and applying it for your own emancipation. The coloniality of global power is related to this. So what is reparative philanthropy as I prepare to end? Well, what are those new approaches to cooperation? How do we challenge structural inequities between countries, within countries? How do we center justice in our development? From a gender lens, how do we invest in the enterprise of women, in social and economic, and apply an intersectional lens to ensure that what are truly decolonizing methodologies in African philanthropies? What are practical reparative actions that must be embedded in what we do? How do we stop using the master's tool in trying to bring down the master's house? It has been suggested by Dalbeck that you radically convene spaces for global majority. This is a space. Dalbeck suggests sharing tools and resources for reconstituting organizations. I know you will do that. Sustainable, flexible, rapid funding support, sometimes catalytic support that looks at untested ideas. Some of you have been doing this for a long time. Financial tools, accounting models, narrative change, data and evidence gathering. The dominant trends suggest to you that domestic resource mobilization, improve the quality of ODA, get hybrid financing, locally led development. Now, I want to suggest to you that all these things are okay if the problem we are fixing is a technical problem of scarcity of funding or a funding gap. But that's not what we are fixing now. What we are fixing is a fundamental question on reimagining development and reimagining philanthropy in ways where we are not doing quick fixes, social engineering, or simply little cash transfer to deal with the fact that our governments no longer have social policy that's integrated to economic policy or ecological policy that is integrated to investment policy. So trust-based philanthropy, unrestricted, flexible funding, flexible support does not fix structure. Collective giving, community-led pooled funds that are expanded does not fix structure. Climate and systems thinking, strategic, adaptive, locally rooted planning, it's needed, but it doesn't fix structure. Youth-led innovation, a demographic political opportunity that we can invest in youth innovation labs. Youth can make applications, and then, this application does not fix structure of how global intellectual property rights are ordered. Business ecosystem, transformation, interconnected approaches where business, private sector, and public sector co-invest doesn't fix structure. I'm sorry to my friends in business. Many of you, if we have another global economic crisis, you'll be unemployed and unemployable. Ask people in philanthropy. I'll tell you why that's an important thing. First, let's distinguish between, is it important to do a partnership with government, public sector, and private sector? It is. But once we are doing it, let's not sit back and think we've reached emancipation. It's not enough to address the global structural inequities. Law reform is not enough because it's not self-funding. You will still need the domestic resources, creative resources to fund. Ask the South Africans. They tried to do land reform to address reparative questions of the past. Where did the opposition come from? An Oval Office away from them. Why is the empire concerned about what a country with less than 70 million Africans is doing about its own history? It's because global systems are very much locally interested. Their survival depends on how we exercise sovereignty or don't over our natural resource wealth, over our human capital worth, over our ideation worth. I need you to understand this. It's not just a distinction between you and your leadership. So, Irungu, how do we decolonize, reimagine, and act? Challenge the sanitized role of philanthropy in maintaining colonial power structures. Number one, understand yourself as an agent of coloniality of power. At least, one of the things that you must do, accept. Are you playing a good role? Yes. Were native commissioners who were registering Africans, giving birth certificates, playing a good role? Yes. But what role were they playing? Sustainable security surveillance for the colonial state to maintain its power. But did natives need birth certificate? Yes, so that they could be counted and schooled and taken to hospital. So the necessity of what you are doing is not necessarily linked to its transformative value. Number two, reimagine tools, values, and actors in Africa's philanthropy landscape. I think the biggest givers should be African thieves. Irungu, I just want to say, every time we arrest someone for corruption, many of you are saying, let's arrest them. Let's just go to their house, we take the Rolls Royces, we take the mansions, we then say, well, you're going to go to prison for your criminal liability, but for your moral liability, you are going to contribute to 100 schools, to 1,000 hospitals, to paying the fees there. We're still going to take back the money that you stole. But since you are creative at creating money without working, be creative in creating value amongst your own communities. The fight against corruption in Africa must go beyond its moralization. The responsibility of investors in Africa who have contributed to disease, sometimes knowingly, by how much they dump toxins in our soil and emit toxins in our air, must be linked to what is the, not corporate social responsibility. What is the level of accountability for economic transformation, not creating jobs, but creating wealth for local communities, whether these are share ownership schemes or other means that work. Lastly, act with intention. Center justice, systems thinking, and reparative action in all your investments. Whatever I said in practical terms, I've come and rubbished all the things that you think are solutions, in part, not because I don't think they work. Every private sector person knows that offering scholarships, internships, works in creating some employment. You can't solve everything all at the same time. But unless you appreciate the enormity of the challenge, you'll be very complacent. Excessive complacency is what has created stasis and what has created lack of sovereign aspiration within the philanthropic sector. So I simply came to say, I respect you. That's why I asked you to celebrate yourselves in the beginning. But respect is not enough to keep freedom. Outrage is what is required to keep freedom. Outrage is not enough to keep freedom. Imagination, radical imagination, is what's needed. Performance is not enough, or radical imagination is not enough. Radical execution and implementation. But you can't implement if you don't have skills. That means this sector, Irungu, needs a radical upskilling and reskilling in questions of artificial regenerative AI, in tech, and other forms. But the biggest education for this sector is stop these pornographic visits to villages and to slums, where you come and you view in secret poverty of the people, and you go back and you write a glossy report where intervening, what did we do? We built 3 Blair toilets, 4 water taps, we sent 1,000 girls to school. Do something more radical. Thank you.